Today we are picking up, excuse me, with compromises made at the Constitutional Convention. We started off with the Great Compromise, which was determining how many houses of Congress there would be and how many representatives each state would get. Now we're moving on to disagreements between southern and northern states. So you will continue in your guided notes. Now the states have to decide what to do about slavery. It wasn't an issue on whether or not they were going to have slaves. And I wrote in here, the southern states would never agree to the Constitution if slavery was banned. So that wasn't the issue. If the North had come out and said, no more slavery, the southern representatives at the Constitutional Convention meeting would have gotten up and left, and we wouldn't have gotten a new constitution. So that wasn't the issue, because for the southern states, they relied on slavery too much. And if you got rid of slaves, their entire economies would collapse. The issue that had to be determined was whether or not slaves would be counted towards a state's population. And you have to remember the number of representatives a state gets in the House is going to be determined by population. So the question is, and I think I put it down here, for a state, the more population they have, the more representatives they get, the more power they have. So the question is, should slaves be counted towards a state's population? And here's the breakdown. If you quickly look at the map, red states are slave states, blue states are free states. So a clear dividing line between the North and the South. Don't worry about this. This was an activity we did in class. What I want you to do, go ahead and pause this video, get on Edpuzzle, watch what I have up there, then come back. Notice on the Edpuzzle, you don't have to watch the entire thing. We're just going to watch from the 3:57 mark to the 5:28 mark. But watch that Edpuzzle, those 2 minutes. That will be helpful. And then come back and we'll continue our discussion. So after watching the Edpuzzle, we can continue with the notes. The issue of slavery, and this is question number 12. What did the South want with respect to slaves being counted? For the southern states, they wanted to be counted as one person, because if you count them as one person, they have more people, more representatives. Northern states didn't want them to be counted at all. They viewed slaves as not people, they argued that southern states viewed slaves as property and not people. So here's the dilemma. South wants them counted as one. North doesn't want them counted, so they compromise, 3/5 compromise. And that simply said, all slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person when it came to counting a state's population. Some, like I mentioned earlier, some were for abolishing slavery, but southern states said it would ruin the South's economy, so that wasn't really an issue. Then another compromise was met. The slave trade, as you guys probably know, in the United States, our history of slavery is based on African slavery, where people from Africa would be brought into the United States and put into slavery. So that's what I mean about the slave trade, coming from Africa into the United States. They made another compromise that said after 1808, southern states would no longer be able to import or bring in slaves to the United States from Africa. So they're signing this. This is 1787. So in roughly 20 years from that date, southern states can no longer bring in slaves. You might think, and I put it up here, does this mean at some point that the South would no longer have slaves in the future? Because if I think about this, okay, they bring in slaves in 1808, but in 1809, they can no longer bring in slaves. So yes, they have slaves for the next 40, 50, 60 years, but eventually slaves, being people, will die. So does that mean at some point in the future, the South will no longer have slaves if they can't bring them in from Africa? And the answer, long story short, the answer is no, because what slave owners would do is their slaves would often have children, and those children that were born to slaves were slaves themselves. So slavery would continue in the South for the foreseeable future. So that is the 3/5 compromise and the slave trade.